Hello and welcome. If you are a chief security officer, risk manager, or part of law enforcement who are charged with security of government buildings, civil infrastructure, academics, or huge institutions, or more importantly, if you are responsible to secure the human life, then this discussion is going to be very important for you. If you are taking care of critical infrastructure in terms of data centers, oil and gas, nuclear plants, thermal plants, or any other kind of institute which is very critical, wherein any kind of intrusion may result into vast destructions, then this discussion is going to be very important for you. If you are part of military forces who are ready to enhance their defense potential by incorporating new technologies and safeguard their cantonments, their borders, or the strategic assets in terms of radars, ammunition centers, or any other installation, then definitely this discussion is going to mean a very lot to you. To discuss on this very important topic, I have invited Mr. Richard Flint. Mr. Richard Flint is part of Building Research Establishment. BRE is a world's leading multidisciplinary building science organization. So, Mr. Richard, I welcome you once again.
Delightful to join you here from the UK, and it just goes to show where technology have taken us to that I can join you in this way. So thank you very much for inviting me along today.
Thank you once again. It is our pleasure to invite you, and once again, I extend my warm welcome to you on behalf of A1 fans. So, Mr. Richard, before moving ahead, I would request if you could please introduce yourself a little bit more, and as well BRE, that what is actually BRE doing in terms of physical security solutions.
Very much so. So I've been in the role 28 years. As I joked with someone the other day, it's a strange role because it wasn't the job I applied for. But that's a very long story. In fact, that was more for another part of our business, which is one of the leading fire testing areas. But yeah, I've been doing the job 28 years. I trained as a mechanical engineer. To be honest, I wasn't very good at making and designing things, but I did have a sort of knack for breaking things, which is perfect for this role, because what do we do in this field? Well, we break products. We break forced entry products, forced entry protection products, I should say, to determine what delay they provide against forced entry fields. So I don't actually come with a security background, but in that 28 years, I have very much learned from day one when we were owned by the insurers. And I'll probably come on to that again a bit later during the conversation, but I learned from the conversations I had, conversations like this, in terms of security and how organizations do their security. And I then blended that with my mechanical engineering background and my innate ability to break things rather than make things to do that evaluation. In that period of time, I've been responsible for writing many standards. The principal one we'll probably discuss today, which is LPS 1175, LPS standing for Loss Prevention Standard. Is one I've been more responsible for since 2000, 2001. But before that, I'd written some other standards for asset registration, for office furniture and equipment used by government and others. But really, since about 2000, responsible for 1175 and some radical changes that I'm sure, again, are going to crop up during these discussions, which have taken into account our learning about the attitudes of the offenders. I suppose those probably on the call are wanting to mitigate the actions of offenders, whether that's criminals, terrorists, protesters, or others. Very much understanding their mindset and then developing it from there. So yes, 28 years of writing those standards. I've also been involved in American standards. I was briefly for a few years involved in ASTM standards. So yeah, F2781 for fencing and a host of others. European standards, but there aren't any for fencing in Europe. Germany have started creating some, but very much in Europe it was standards for forced entry on buildings, EN 1627. And in more recent times, engaging with people as far afield as Australia, where they've adopted actually the LPS standard within their standard for protective security against violent acts in place of their own Australian standard that they previously used. So a lot of standards work, which for a lot of people can be rather boring. It's all numbers. But those numbers are important, and hopefully today we'll sort of dispel some myths and people might learn to embrace what standards are in this field and how they can help them.
True. So, Richard, if I may like to understand, and it is for benefit of all the people who are watching this across, whoever is the key stakeholder in this security domain, that what exactly is role of BRE? Though I understand that role of BRE is very very vast, but when we
Yes.
uh, limit ourselves of understanding with respect to role of BRE in unauthorized access and physical security measures, then how actually BRE plays a very important role.
Yeah, but well, it's probably a good point to start with is the broader what is BRE, why it got us to a position, what places us in a position where we can influence and support. So, Building Research Establishment was started around 1921, so we're over 100 years old. It was started between the Great War, the First World War, and the Second World War by government, which had a need to develop cheap housing, which they called homes for heroes for people in that period of time. UK had lost a lot of money funding.
True.
There were plenty of people that came back from the war and they needed that support. So that's when Building Research Establishment started in terms of developing homes for heroes, but also developing regulations to control construction to ensure the quality and performance of construction, whether that's structural to stop accidental collapse of buildings. And a lot of work was done around Ronan Point many years ago as a tower block where there was a significant collapse of the building. Fire regulations, making sure they're set and in place, and we were doing that sort of work through till 1997. In 97, BRE was privatized. It's now run under a charitable organization, which helps to make sure that we're focused not necessarily on making profits and distributing profits to others. The profits that we make from doing evaluation work are regurgitated through the system and reinvested in improving the built environment. And that is very much one of BRE's key objectives, is to build a better world for others, whether it's on the product side, like we'll be talking today, or on the environmental side, which has been a big part of BRE since then, through our BREEAM schemes and other initiatives, making sure the built environment considers ecological and environmental effects. But coming back to the product side, when I joined in 1997, I joined Loss Prevention Certification Board. At that time, LPCB was owned by the UK insurers. We looked after the insurers' interests in terms of building protection, principally fire, which was our expertise, and BRE in parallel were doing that for UK government. But also in the early 90s, they turned to LPCB, the insurers, and said, we're starting to suffer losses from crime. Not so much terrorism. Terrorism wasn't insurable until much later, but certainly from crime, there was high crime rates in the mid-90s, and they were going the wrong way. UK government trying to do their bit, but UK insurers couldn't sue the government. They needed to look after their own interests. They turned to LPCB and said, look, we need you to develop standards. Because for the insurers, they develop standards that go beyond basic regulations. So, although I call them basic regulations, UK regulations, and I'm sure this will be the case in India and other places where your viewers are watching this from, focus on protecting people, and that is fundamental, and I wouldn't take away from that. That has to be at the very core of what we do in anything, making sure people are safe. But for insurers, they suffer losses on asset other than personal asset. If a building burns down, they could have loss of that building, the cost of replacing that building, but the stock, and also the continuity losses of that whatever services were delivered from that building, those losses. So that's significant for an insurer. So stopping that and having measures that not only buy time for people to egress out of the building in the fire, but making sure as much of that asset is protected from the fire as possible, whether that's suppression systems, or passive fire protection, so compartmentation for fire, which is a very strong parallel with what we do on security on forced entry, needs to be there. And so we wrote back then standards for insurers that went beyond the regulations and helped to protect asset. Whereas our focus was different for the insurers. Our focus was on the risk holder. 100%. What is the risk holder's needs? What are their objectives? What are they trying to achieve from this? And so we wrote our standards around those requirements, which is very different, as I say, to other standards. So that is the history. Now, in 2000, BRE bought LPCB from the insurers. There was change in legal positions in Europe on what insurers were allowed to do as collective bargaining. So we came under LPCB, but we've continued to write our standards in the same way. We've continued to engage with stakeholders, whether that's insurers, albeit I have to say less so, because generally, certainly in the UK, the level of cover means that losses through burglary tend not to hit insurers, unless you're talking about jewelry or other very high value assets. Terrorism, as I alluded to earlier, tended not to be covered. We have an organisation called Pool Re, a reinsurance organisation that was partly set up, I believe, by UK government. That's very involved in counter-terrorism and covering that in the same way. There's also a thing called Flood Re in the UK, which was set up to deal with insurance on flooding, to make sure the insurance industry offered cover for people who needed it. That meant there is insurance, as opposed to previously there really wasn't much insurance, if any, available for that. So yeah, terrorism, there's a need, but even those insurers will still want to make sure the risks are appropriately mitigated to minimize the likely impact on their customers, and likewise then on them if there's a loss. So our focus remains, but the scope of how the standards are used has grown massively. Originally created, particularly 1175, for the threat of acquisitional crime, people breaking in to steal assets. In the late 90s, there were some IRA, Irish Republican terrorist attacks or attempted attacks on infrastructure in the UK mainland, which thankfully were caught, but it made government realise on how close, how vulnerable particular assets might be. They did a complete review of criticality of all those assets, and many countries have been doing this since. We had our counter-terrorism strategy contest with its 4 pillars, one of which is protect. On our bit of the protect strand, focusing on that criticality, how attractive assets are to people, and then making sure appropriate measures are put in place. Now, we didn't set what those boundaries were, and on this call, because of national security reasons, I won't be able to discuss what they are for particular assets, but they'd select protection levels to standards according to the perceived value of the asset to the hostile actor, which is a reflection of the value of that asset to the UK economy, how our world operates. And the same parallels would be true whether you're in India, Australia, America, or anything. Governments will look at that sensibly and will pick what their appetite is for the loss of those assets. And in the UK's case, they identified 1175 as being a standard that would support that. And from that point onwards, the standards are developed from protecting drinking water to all sorts of types of critical assets. And then from that, other countries who've also started facing issues, not necessarily just from terrorism like we did, albeit sadly many countries have suffered and do continue to suffer from the threat of terrorism. But in recent times, as I'm sure even in India you're aware, We've seen state-sponsored acts involving sabotage occurring right away across Europe. Other countries have had those sort of targeted attacks. Sometimes they're by state-sponsored, sometimes it might be attacks by protest groups. There's all sorts of triggers for the hostile action, but ultimately those actors want to breach the layers of security, of which in many cases, if there's space to, the sensible thing is to have a fence and a wider perimeter with gates, turnstiles, etc. Their first stage is to breach that perimeter. And so that's meant our standards start very much at the perimeter. So that's really, hopefully, albeit a long answer, who BRE are, LPCB,
No,
and where we come from in this.
it is very very encouraging, and as I have learned that BRE definitely focuses on safety, security, and a greener future. So
Yeah.
I have also been associated with defense forces, and what you have mentioned, that a human life is very very precious. I also accept the fact that anything which is accessible, anything which can be touched, it becomes a very very lucrative item, and there are high chances that people with different intents might cause a damage or steal it. But when, like you have mentioned in the discussion, that LPS 1175 is the standard which is being followed in your country, and then definitely it can create a large impact if followed across the globe. So,
Yeah.
like a layman who is not very much expert, and definitely I don't hold any kind of this kind of experience like you are you are holding for 28 years. So if you want me or a layman like me to understand that, for example, if I have to secure my any kind of cantonments or garrisons or any kind of establishment, and I have to secure that, then how does this LPS 1175 will help me? Apart from this, if I adopt this 1175, then what differences will it make on ground as compared to the conventional practices which are being followed by different security personnels across the domain? And I would say, and you will also agree, that awareness about the kind of standardization is very very less. For example, I would say that, and it is across the globe, that the awareness or the knowledge about different level of security is very very less. In some cases we find that the farm lands are secured with equivalent kind of specification and equivalent kind of fences which are used at border, or
Yeah.
the places, or I would say that hotels or residential complexes have equivalent kind of security fences being used which are there at the borders. It does not make sense. So first of all, please make me understand that if I adopt these LPS 1175 standards, what differences will it bring to my overall security system which I'm going to create, and how it is different from the conventional security measures which are being followed?
Well, there's a couple of strands I'd like to follow on this. The one that, yeah, immediately I thought, yes, I'll talk about, but one's just come to mind is I think the first measure when you talk about people using fences, for example, for farmland, etc. If we take the farmland, that's there to stop something that isn't necessarily with a human intent
Yeah,
of getting demarcation.
yeah, it is
It's saying
demarcation.
this is our land. If you come on this, it's protest. Or for animals, in that case, it's stopping the animals migrating out of that environment. But those animals only have themselves, so they have bodily force, and they might, depending on the type of animal, be able to jump. Which would then affect how high the fence is, or they might be able to climb. And I don't think any fence is going to stop monkeys getting over. So you might have to use other measures for that, or electric fencing and such like. And again, I was, well, I say lucky enough to have been born in South Africa, but lucky enough to go to game reserves. And again, electric fencing to stop and deter some animals, which we can use for people. But when it comes to people and forced entry, what we need is what we call an effective security triangle. A fence alone will provide a delay, but if you do not know someone's breaching the fence and don't respond to it, they will be successful in that. So
True.
while we're talking today very much about the delay measure, it is vitally important, viewers, bear in mind all three sides of the triangle and the central bit, which is management, making sure people understand what that security is and how it should be used. There's no point in a large, expensive perimeter fence if someone leaves the gate open and doesn't keep it monitored, because you can just walk straight through it. So
Exactly.
it's really important people have management, which is in the center. On the left-hand vector, you've got the detection measures, and detection really should come first, which might be difficult on a fence line, but we can explore that. And you've got to have the response. But running across the bottom, and this is sort of a time triangle, is the time for delay. And that the time you get from your delay measures must at least match the time while you detect and respond. So if you've got a fence line with perimeter detection systems, you need that delay to be long enough for you to determine that that intrusion is occurring, for that perimeter detection to trigger, for any consideration of is that another false alarm, and we know how susceptible to false alarms detection can be. So having visual confirmation or other things that say, yes, this really is an attack. And then for that response to deal with that attack and stop the intruder in appropriate time. Now, if we get that wrong, and that could be wrong on any side, it could be the inappropriate detection, it could be an inappropriate response. At the top of that triangle, I should add, is probably not a triangle, it's a trapezium. You have the alarm transmission, transferring that alarm to whoever the response is, because the response isn't likely to be immediately accessible. But while all that's happening, you need that delay. And sadly, there's an example in the UK recently, a very public example that was quite embarrassing for our Royal Air Force and for our government, was Brize Norton. And at Brize Norton, these protesters managed to create a hole through a very flimsy fence, get through. I understand they had electric scooters, as sort of the stand-up type of scooter, as opposed to other motorbike type scooters. Get down to aircrafts, spray into the engines, and get away.
Oh my
Potentially
gosh.
huge cost on one of our main airfields, for deploying aid. Weirdly, supposedly it was used to deploy aid to support the people that was targeted. Again, I'm not an expert in its use, or whether that's factually correct, but that's certainly what I had. But coming back to this point of protection, the fence failed. Well, actually, the triangle failed, and I've mentioned this on LinkedIn recently. What we don't know is, did it fail because the fence didn't offer enough delay? Well, it certainly didn't. So you could argue the fence was the failure point. Did it fail because no one detected it? Well, if they did, they definitely didn't respond. So whether it was the detection or the response failed, or both, but ultimately the whole triangle fell apart. And that led to some embarrassment. But having many discussions with people afterwards, some people have said, well, that far away, you wouldn't necessarily expect to have that delay. You'd expect people to be picked up in the environment because the asset is a long way away. Now, on the equation, it might well have been that for the response, they've gone, right, we need the response in this time, but they hadn't factored in the delay from ground, from territory. We've got one delay from cutting a hole in the fence line. There's also the time to climb through the fence line, and then the time to migrate from the fence line to whatever your target might be. In this case, it was the aircraft. Is that, or was that time considered based on people running or walking? Possibly not considered in terms of someone popping a vehicle effectively through, albeit in the form of an electric scooter, and then migrating on that at a far quicker space, sort of Usain Bolt type pace, for a lot further than Usain would have previously done on his 100 or 200 meters, may not have been factored in. So that is a really important learning from us, is you need to consider the delay in terms of transition from the non-secure side of your barriers to the asset, your pathway analysis, as we call it. Do be open-minded about what people might use in order to transverse across that space, but then make sure that the time you get from the delay measures is enough to ensure they're not going to get to the asset in time. So that's what we need to do to effective security. And then how we do that with the standard is we're benchmarking the resistance provided by a fence line in terms of how many minutes of delay does it provide, depending on the tools used.
So, Richard, but it is very clear, and it is like you mentioned one of the example, and I'm sure that it is one of its kind. There must be hundreds of examples which are occurring on day-to-day basis, and definitely it is a matter of concern. Now, there are incidents which are occurring, and these like if somebody can breach into the national or strategic assets, then it is very alarming, and it is happening across the globe as well. Now we have a problem statement, and we have a solution which you have just also mentioned about. But now we are concerned, or we need to discuss, or we need to be bothered about that what is the response, how is market responding, or how the end users are responding to these kind of technologies. Like BRE is one of the standard which can give solution to the multiple, and I would say universal problem of breaching into any kind of strategic assets or critical assets and causing damage, and it brings same at international level. This is also a fact. But then why are people not aware about the options which are available to them, or are they not ready to implement? What is exactly happening? Is there a issue of awareness, or is there
Yeah.
issue of intent to adopt those things?
Like many things, it's digital rather than binary. So I think you've hit it with two. Always first comes awareness. You're not going to ask for something if you don't know exists. So things like this are great because it's helping to ensure people are aware. In the UK, it's been widely used and adopted. Why have we seen it used in other countries? I think largely that is because of people between those countries communicating with each other, sharing best practice. We obviously are known in the UK and beyond for having what is termed the Five Eyes community, and through the Commonwealth, there's a lot of sharing within Commonwealth countries on best practices. You've got alliances such as NATO, where again there can be sharing, albeit I've seen less so in terms of military. Understandably, military tends to be very closed. Even we've not had much engagement with military. They tend to be very concerned, it's national security risks, etc. That said, military do come along to exhibitions, and we've been involved in many around the world, particularly in the UK, but we have done live demonstration testing in Dubai at the Intersec exhibition on several occasions, and that creates learning opportunities, and we've seen that people pick up. The other way in which people we've seen learn and have picked up on 175 is through worldwide organizations, particularly in the data center sector, where they have a low appetite for loss, because the consequences of loss on a data center every second could cost thousands, if not millions, if not billions. I think the first data center I was ever involved in to the west of London, and this is 12, 13 years ago, I think was dealing with $2 billion worth of transactions per day. That is a massive loss if that's not
That is
operating. So those operators know that it will destroy their business, let alone have wider government impact, which is why in the UK critical infrastructure now includes data, because data drives economies. It's probably in many ways more valuable than oil, etc. Albeit while we still rely on fossil fuels to an extent to power them, maybe the fossil fuels still remain to an extent critical, along with in the UK nuclear, wind, etc. But data is critical. We've seen the impact of it with telecoms losses in Spain a month or so ago, where they lost telecoms for quite a few hours, what impact that has. But if that extends to all data, not just use of telephones, that is a significant impact. Those operators are aware of it. They're very risk averse in terms of the potential impact of flood, fire, and security. So they will look out for how do they benchmark, because they're also responsible. if you're the security manager for a large.com data processing organization, data holding, you want to sleep at night, and yet you know something might happen somewhere, but you don't necessarily know what, when, and where. The hostile actor always has the element of surprise, which is a challenge for the security manager, and is why, in so many ways, I'm pleased I do my work because at least I've got certainty with what I do. What they do has a lot of uncertainty. But one of the uncertainties we can take away with the standards and what we see them adopting and then sharing worldwide by deploying it within their specifications in countries, which then tend to be picked up by governments and then act as a feedback loop to governments going, well, why are you X organization using that? They explain and go, oh, we weren't aware of that. We could make use of that, and that propagates. But coming back to that person who's responsible, they don't know where, when, how. Coming back to the IRA after the Brighton bombing, where they targeted our Conservative government in, I think it was 1983 or 1984 in Brighton. They bombed the hotel they were having their party conference in, and afterwards said, you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky some of the time. And that is so true. The hostile actor always has the element of surprise. That's why you do your threat, risk, and vulnerability assessments to determine that. The vulnerability ties back to that exploitable gap we've talked about. But what is your threat actor, and what are the risks you face if they're successful? What are your consequences, consequential losses? Now, if you determine that and identify who that threat actor is, and then deploy fencing, you can get a delay. But the problem you then face is, how do you know what delay a fence is going to get? By looking at it. Even when people talk about 358, which is based about the dimensions of a mesh, rather similar to the one probably that's behind you right now. But what is the wire diameter? Are they talking about the wire with the paint, or are they talking it as the wire diameter? What is the quality of the welds? Because you could have welds that hold it together, but the amount of power you put into the fence, which is cost, that electricity for the welding costs money. If you do a slightly lighter duty weld, you could make a lot cheaper panel. It might look all right until it's bent, or over time, and not much time, the welds start failing. And then the resistance provided by the fence is so much less, it's degraded, let alone corrosion and other things that can happen. And also in terms of forced entry, if someone's talking about a wire thickness, but really what they're talking about is the coated thickness, that could have a thin piece of chicken wire going through it that could be cut extremely easily. Looks great, isn't there. So it's really difficult for the specifier to know what's there. So it's one thing being aware that there are standards there that can be benchmarked, but the other thing that they need to be aware of is the impact of cost, and what is their appetite? How concerned are they about their assets? And if they are concerned, value really is that assurance divided by the potential impact if they get it wrong. If they get it wrong by getting a cheap fence, they've not only got to replace that fence because it would have been breached too easily, but they've also lost the asset, which is why they invested in the fence in the first place. So that's a double knock. So yes, on the one side, we've got that awareness, and I thank you, because what we find is it's very hard to get that awareness around the world, but when people become aware of the standard, they tend to adopt it. But then it comes down to a perception of value. And often what we see is the end users get that value very quickly. Consultants who specialize in security get that value. Where I personally see it fail, and I get very frustrated with it because there's not much we can do at the moment, certainly from our own pace, this would really come down to the people engaging them, is the contractor. Is the contractor who's given a job, yes, build this, who then goes off and gets something that isn't what was intended and installs that because it gives them more profit on the project, because the customer has got a perception of it's this, it will cost this, they've bid at that, but they've supplied something cheaper. In the UK, we've seen the instances of that dramatically reduce because people use the evidence available to them through what I'll call the red book. So all the products we certified to 1175 are listed in one listing. Unfortunately, it's only available in English, but it's available to access to anyone in the world to verify whether the product supplied is compliant. If people use that to verify that compliance, it helps stop people supplying faulty product that looks similar but isn't compliant. Sadly, there are other parts of the world which I won't name particularly, but I'm sure many on this call will appreciate where they are. Um, and that culturally isn't there yet. But it changed within 2 or 3 years in the UK. I think the last instances I remember were when a very well known architectural engineering consultancy, a global one, were responsible for reviewing evidence for products being installed on the Olympics in London. And they would come to us and say, is this certificate legitimate? Because back then we didn't have it online. And the amount of fakes we saw, which they were then able to address to stop the wrong products appearing. But also with that, they weren't doing that evidence at the end of the project. They were doing it sufficiently far in advance because a stat I should have probably mentioned already, and I haven't done, so apologies, but not to put people off in terms of manufacturers, but for specifiers, it's an important stat. We fail 95% of the products submitted to us. 95% of the products submitted by manufacturers to us for evaluation do not achieve the delay those manufacturers expect those products to achieve. That is a significant level of risk for people who are buying products that aren't already certified by us to the standard, in this case 1175. And yet, too often, people only ask for the evidence of compliance on something right at the end when the project needs to go live. And by then, if they've been given a faulty product, it's too late. And what we tend to see is people then bury that truth and go, "Ooh, yeah, that's inconvenient. We'll bury it," as opposed to dealing with it far earlier in the procurement chain to make sure at the point that someone is being given the contract to supply product, they're able to deliver the evidence that that product's certified. And I think if people can do that, so it's one, knowing about the standards, it's two, having the appetite for a product that will deliver the right security, and the third thing is to use the evidence that we give people freely. There's no cost to people other than the manufacturer to do the testing, to access that evidence to make sure what they receive delivers the protection they're expecting.
So definitely, and what you said, it is exactly true. And let's say that this today's discussion is our bit towards creating awareness amongst the people. And quality control and quality assurance is definitely a big issue, wherein you as a domain expert or me as a manufacturer can give our bit to the people who has intention to ensure that yes, the correct product is given, but at the end it is definitely the responsibility of person who is at the receiving end or executing that product. But like you have mentioned about delay rated fans and the technical specifications or what differences it can make. But Richard, as you are aware that any kind of standardization or any kind of thing which is new in market has to show some success. So would you mind sharing any of the case studies where these delay rated fences were deployed and any kind of intrusion which could have maybe resulted in loss of very critical asset or strategic data or anything? Could you share any kind of those case studies with us? And then I would also request you that please let us know that whenever any new segment is introduced, people get very conscious with respect to price. But one thing which they are not understanding, that if you deploy a cheap thing which has no guarantee, warranty, quality control or quality assurance, then you will be investing double of its price or maybe multiple times more in its maintenance, and the loss which might get incurred in case of breach will not be fulfilled again. So people have to understand this also. So I would request that could you share any of the story which it will be very interesting. that a standard conventional fence is deployed anywhere, and then I have to invest more and more on its maintenance. And if breached, then the loss is, I would say, non-negotiable.
Well, very good question. An awkward one for me because we certify the products, but we don't necessarily have the discussions with the users. And very few will come and go, yeah, we've had this attack, it wasn't successful. And maybe, I'm hoping, that is very much linked to the deterrence, that if people pick their and pick the right products, the hostile actor will be deterred. And actually, on that, and maybe I need to quickly explore because I haven't covered it already, the rating system. So we don't just pass or fail a fence. Fences are rated according to their delay against different levels of attack. With that, and it was a big change we developed from about 2015 when we recognized that offenders tend to operate in an entrepreneurial manner, which I'll come back to. So in 2019, we published a revised version of the standard, issue 8, which was a big change from before. Rather than having what we had was 8 levels, other standards have different numbers of levels. Back then we had security 1, rating 1, all the way to security rating 8. That went from 1 minute up to 20 minutes. It went 1, 3, 5, 10, and then there were a few layers at 10, and then SR8 was 20 minutes. And as we went up in risk, the tools got bigger and bigger, less concealable, etc. So we sort of thought about the threat actor. Concealability, portability, and things are very much. Value of the tools is also a consideration. But what we hadn't considered was the risk appetite of the intruder. Are you going to use bigger tools? If you're going to use bigger tools, will you want to do it quicker? Our old standard and many others out there like EN 1627, etc., assume, and the European standard continues to assume, that people will use bigger tools to take longer. Whereas what we found in studying offender mindsets was no, like people in the demolition market and construction market, you use bigger tools to be more efficient, to do things quicker.
Exactly.
And they do the same. So the new standard is a matrix style where along the bottom we've got the delay 1, 3, 5, 10. We've added a 15 and a 20. And up the side we've still got 8 levels, but people aren't forced to take more delay. And I'm sure if you're those viewing it want to see more, they can certainly download an infographic that helps them visualize this from us, and I'm sure it'll be available through A1 as well. So we've got those measures, and if people get it right, what we see is the entrepreneurial offender model, which is what is the return I'm looking to achieve for this? What is the investment in tools and stamina and strength I need? And what are the risks? And we used to say it was one is less than or equal to the other plus risk. And now it tends to be times risk, because we see risk really plays on the mindset, as it does with businesses. As a business person, if you think, yes, I can invest in that, the return's going to be greater than the investment. But if you think it's risky, it's going to have more impact on whether you will invest to get that return. And the same with the offender, whether they're a terrorist, criminal, or otherwise, they're making that decision. It may be a snap decision with an opportunist who sees a car window open and reaches in and takes something, to someone targeting a nuclear power station where they know there's armed police, there's several layers of protection, etc. They're going to go, great, I want to target this, but this will take significant investment and be risk. And if people get it right, and they tend to when they're using 1175, because their use of 1175 shows they've thought about this, then it will deter. Because if the second side of the equation outweighs the first, like a business person is deterred from investing, a criminal, terrorist, or other is deterred from acting. So we don't tend to hear because of that. But what I can come back to and proudly say is probably that 95% failure rate says that 95% of properties out there that would have otherwise used those unapproved products have been saved from, or potentially saved if they take use of what we talked about after the last question, um, from using products that aren't going to give that delay, that would have an unseen exploitable gap that someone might well exploit. So yes, that in terms of that is where we see that, and we've seen that with people when I present. I remember, oh God, it must be about 2 years ago, being invited to present to the team in the UN that advise on protection of all UN permanent facilities, and they use other standards. Were never aware of 1175, and I explained to them that matrix, how it works, and how as a risk manager you can identify your threat actor, what tools they might be willing to use to target an asset. You know from the triangle what your delay needs to be, and from that you can pick what you need your level to be. That might, let's say the attacker's going to be using 18 volts tools, which are very portable, you don't need wires, etc., and some manual tools. That would be at what we call the E level. And you may identify on a site from the fence line to the asset, and with the response you might need 15 minutes of overall delay. You can either pick an E15 product, which in one layer gives you all that 15 in one layer, or you can take into account the travel time. So you might say we need a 10-minute delay, but it's going to take 5 minutes for them to access. But obviously, with what happened at Bryce Norton, consider that very carefully and tend to err on the side of caution. But with this standard, you could then say, right, I'm going to invest a fence line, because the fence line is the biggest thing in terms of material. In terms of environmental costs and things, there's a lot of potential steel. Are you going to build an E10 rated steel wall around your perimeter, which no one can see through, etc.? Or are you going to deploy a barrier that might be, let's say, E3, a lot more affordable to achieve that delay with that product, but then you'd have other layers. Now that might be 2 fence layers, and I would always advocate for that if you've got the space, because you can use sterile zone detection and other things, plus you've got those 2 layers of delay there. So you might have 2E3 layers of fencing, that gives you 6 minutes, and you're now only worried about 4 minutes. Well, on the building facade, you could then put an E5, walling, doors, etc., and you've achieved your own. That is very unique. As much as it sounds, hopefully, to the audience sensible, and I'd like to think, yes, it's very sensible. You've got one threat actor who's going to use a set of tools that they want to break every layer in your defense in-depth strategy. Other standards, sadly, around the world don't allow you to do that to one criteria. 1175 is extremely unique in that regard. You can benchmark all your layers to give that certainty, which again means that those deploying it tend not to have the breaches. So probably not the answer you wanted. I can't give examples of this site on this day and that. And then coming on to your other part of your question in terms of the cost of quality, yes, as I alluded to earlier, if you buy something that looks great but isn't great, it's going to rust, need replacing. It won't do the job, so you'll lose the asset. Now, with that, there is a danger that we could test a golden sample. Someone could go, right, this is a great fence panel. It's like the one behind you. It will give you X resistance to this level of threat. We certify it, we do a test, and this could potentially, probably a parallel with this would be hostile vehicle mitigation, where people tend to do a test and then go for 10, 20, 30 years on, yes, this was tested. But does the industry suffer from shrinkification? Like certainly in the UK we do, where famous toilet roll brands, the outside of the toilet roll looks the same. So visually you're buying your toilet roll and you think, yes, I'm going to get as much use out of that as otherwise. But the inside of the toilet roll is a bigger diameter, which means you've got less toilet roll. It's less weight. They're getting a lot of saving. They're selling less for the same price. It's costing less for transporting it because it's lighter, etc., etc. Well, the same could happen with vehicle bollards. You buy a bollard and you think, brilliant. That's great. But like fences, that bollard could be affected by the quality of materials used. Are they using the same material now as what was used at the point of test? What you could have is a company cheating and doing a really expensive bollard that they just can't economically sell at the price point to cover it, but have no intention to. But once that's tested, they go and waive a report which is redacted with key details taken out because they go, well, I'm worried you're going to give to someone else to copy the design. But reality is, what's been redacted is clearly telling them it's different to what they're supplying onto the market. To stop that and to ensure the ongoing conformity of what we certify, we have teams of auditors that go into the factories all around the world. They visit your factory in Gujarat, recently done a fence company in China. We're doing doors, shutters, all the products we certify to the standard. Those producers get regular audits. And the purpose of those audits are to cover 3 of the 4 factors that affect performance that we're declaring in the reports. And that would also be true of anyone else doing testing. Now, the factor it doesn't cover, but is important to know, is testing. The quality of the testing. You could take a product to someone who doesn't know what they're doing in terms of testing. You're going to get an artificially very high result. Great for sales, not very good for the client when it gets breached afterwards. So that tends to be found out and people's reputations will be damaged. Unfortunately, the reputation of the procurement team will be damaged, but the reputation of the company selling the product will be damaged when it's breached. So we control that, and I say the fact we fail 95% of the products we test, I think suggests that we're very on it in terms of that as a game. And the other 3 factors that our auditors are focusing in are really important. The design of the product. If you change that design, the diameter, coming back to the bollard, it's going to affect the performance. The quality is the other circle on our Venn diagram for this. If that quality changes, the performance in the middle of the Venn diagram changes. So the quality of the steel used, the quality of welds, if you're doing welds, and coming back to the fence line, the welds, the coatings, if the quality changes. Now, I have to stress that when we're certifying, our focus is on security. There are other tools and standards out there. BRE offers some, but other laboratories out there would do it, which would deal with longevity, with coating performances and stuff like that. The customer needs to consider all of those and ask for evidence of all. When we're doing 1175, we're very much focusing on factors that affect that delay performance. So yes, design, if that changes, the quality of materials and workmanship, that can affect performance. And the third item that they're looking at are the installation instructions. Now, for fencing, we go a bit further than other products. For a door, we're certifying a door that comes out the factory and it's a door set. It's not a door leaf and someone puts it together with something else. It is a set, which we know as that set with that lock will deliver performance. That's possible with doors. With fencing, it's not possible to certify a fence because I don't think there's a lorry big enough to attach a fence that's already constructed for the perimeter. They're assembled on site. The site is a factory, and we're not auditing the installers. That is very challenging. That is something that very much the customer needs to consider in terms of verifying the installers. What we're able to do is benchmark the materials coming out the factory because of the auditors checking those, and then making sure that the drawings that are supplied to site to the contractor follow the rules that we've assessed when certifying that fence. Rules that say, yes, what gradients can you install it on and how are you going to make sure you achieve your height, but also not end up with gaps under the fence that an intruder might exploit. How are you going to form the angles in a fence line? Because very few fences are just straight. Okay, a border fence might go relatively straight, but most sites need corners or angles in them. We will assess that. The manufacturer like yourselves will produce drawings that confirm how that is to be assembled. We will evaluate that and confirm they're correct. And then we list those drawings, those generic drawings, on the certificate. So yours and others' customers can review to make sure that whoever is designing that fence line for them, if it's a landscape architect, that they are understanding and applying those design rules correctly. So in terms of that assurance, we're checking the factory regularly to make sure what you're issuing to site, if installed in accordance with that, will deliver the performance. But as I say, beyond that, your customers do really need to think about their wider operational requirements in terms of suitability of ground structure, the paint finish. If it's in a gritty, dusty, windy atmosphere, that's going to be sandblasted. So you need a different coating to it to maybe a more luscious environment where it's high in moisture, in say a jungle environment where it's going to be corrosion from moisture, or if it's near the sea, that salt corrosion. That is very site specific and needs to be dealt with in terms of paints, finishes, etc.
Exactly. So let's be hopeful, because standards are ready, innovation is ready, technology is there, manufacturer like us who are certified, we are ready. It is just the market or the security stakeholders in different domains who has to accept this. They have to take one step ahead and then understand the technology, for which definitely we as manufacturers and experts, domain experts like you, are always available. But if I say that, I would say that any change which you have to make, it is a very very tedious process, and sometimes it becomes very very painful, but the results fructify in longer duration. So I would request you to suggest some of the advices to these security personals on different domains, security officers or risk managers or key stakeholders. What advice will you give, that how can we adopt these technologies, and what are the fields where it can be implemented immediately and we can see the results?
I would say it's quite simple. I'd hope for most sites, people are starting with a threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment. Because if you're not doing that, you don't know what you need in terms of security. So it's really important you start with that. If you can't do that yourselves, turn to a qualified consultant. In the UK, we have the Register of Security Experts and Specialists, which was set by UK government, and that you've got organisations like ASIS worldwide. You've got the Security Institute and the Association of Security Consultants in the UK, and I'm sure you've got similar in India, and others have. Certainly, I know ASIS is worldwide. They have within that people who understand threat, risk, and vulnerability assessments. So start with that. Once you've identified that, it's about picking an appropriate standard. LPS is the one we publish for fences, and as I say, covers other things. There are others out there, but I'm quietly confident that it is the most fitting because it deals with the layers. Now, NPSA, National Protective Security Authority in the UK, used to be known as Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure. That in that name hints as what they're responsible for through UK government, responsible for revising and ensuring the protection of our infrastructure. They have published a very good guide to forced entry standards, which I very much recommend people download from their website. You don't need to register to go on their website. If you just search for forced entry standards, a page will come up. There's a very interesting animation, but there's an extremely good 18-page guide that talks through the features of forced entry standards. So once you've got that, pick the appropriate standard, and then pick a level that is appropriate to the threat you've identified. And again, whether it's ASIS or others, they'll be able to do that. And then we offer the Red Book, which confirms what products out there achieve that and deliver and are supported by the auditing. So it's very easy to then go and pick a product that can be deployed. And don't make the assumption that if you're trying to install a fence, let's say in Malaysia, and there aren't any fence companies currently listed in the Red Book in Malaysia, that doesn't necessarily mean A1 or others aren't actively supplying fences into that market. Some add details of sales offices into the Red Book and it helps, but talk to the fence companies because you might be surprised in who does provide them. I certainly know A1 are quite a global organisation, so that may be a good place to start. And then the final bit where, unfortunately, I haven't got much advice, but is where it could go wrong, is ensure that your contractor understands what they're delivering. I'd suggest Make sure your contractor has received training from the company who's supplying the product, whether it's a fence, vehicle barrier, or whatever it might be, that they've received training if they're going to do the installation work, or that they have engaged the original manufacturer to do that installation work if they offer, because they know best. And if you do all those, you're going to get a successful project. Now, barring your average product where people haven't done a threat and vulnerability assessment, you go and talk to someone about getting a fence and you get it installed. What I've described adds one layer to that. That layer is doing the threat and vulnerability assessment. And if you want to secure an asset, you have to start there. You have to understand what you're protecting against. And if you don't have that experience, talk to people. There are plenty of people out there, whether consultants or if you're in a data center organization, there are plenty of other peers. You may compete, but in my experience, people like to help each others, and they will, through professional networks, reach out to people and they will support you.
And it is not a very tedious task. We, like you have mentioned, that we are global manufacturers. So in India, what we are trying to do, that as part of this awareness campaign, that how these delay rated fences, which are future of any kind of perimeter security solutions, so wherever we are going, we are imparting these knowledge to people, or this personnel who are dealing with these security things. And we are also taking an additional initiative to invite them to our manufacturing units, so that whatever you have said, that we are trying to do that, and rather successfully executing it, that we will train them and we will impart them knowledges how these new products are functioning. And let's be hopeful that this can create an impact. And I thank you very much. It has been very informative discussion. And we would request that anybody who is in this domain can reach out to you, can reach out to us, and if they have any specific questions, then definitely we can have one more session to discuss those, so that our first objective is to impart as much as awareness to the people, so that these niche products, these new niche technology, which is futuristic in nature, can be adopted. And more importantly, we can move ahead with a secure, sustainable uh, infrastructures. So I wish you all the best, and let's hope that we get a lot of responses from people who are in the security domain and have an appetite and intent to absorb new technologies. Let it be delay rated fences only. So in India, we are already manufacturing, and we are open to help anyone, whoever reaches us. We will help them in implementing these technologies. So I wish you all the best. And your closing remarks, please.
So thank you. Because really, as I say, the biggest challenge is making people aware.
Aware.
Um, if people are aware and decide not to act, they hopefully decide with knowing what the consequences of doing so are. And that brings me back to that need to really understand the threats and vulnerabilities and your responsibility in your role, whether it's a security manager, consultant, or other, for the assets and people that you're protecting. These standards exist. There is guidance out from organizations such as MPSA is out there. Don't be fools, as my mum used to say, and ignore what's out there. If you read it and it's not right for you, fine. But the foolish thing is not to read and consider. So please, thank you for this opportunity to highlight what's available to people. And I hope when they go out and explore it further, it will solve problems that they didn't realize they could easily solve beforehand.
And definitely, and again, with conviction, I give a commitment on this platform to people who are in the security domain, that wherever you are there in globe, if you need any kind of assistance in solving your problem statement, we are definitely there. And Mr. Richard is there to help us to know more about this. And thank you. Please post your questions. We will definitely revert back. And if you need any kind of assistance, consultancy in implementation of these new technologies, we are definitely help you. And thank you, Richard, once again. Hoping to see you soon very much, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jai Hind.